So it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me, Amit. We've had this really, it's this really refreshingly open sort of space, that one doesn't really find in academia so much. So it's been wonderful. I'm also very pleased to be chairing Sumana Roy's session. Sumana has a very wide and versatile range of publications. She's the author of How I Became a Tree, which is a work of nonfiction. She's written Missing, a novel, Out of Syllabus, which is a collection of poems, and a short story collection, My Mother's Lover and Other Stories. Her poems and essays have appeared in a number of publications, Granta, Guernica, LARB, Drunken Boat, and many others. Sumana teaches at Ashoka University, and she's going to be talking to us today about Satyajit Ray's films and his relationship to light, failing light. So welcome, Sumana.
Thank you, Stuti. The title of my talk is Failing Light. As you can see, even though it might sound preposterous to blame poor light for being a failure, I'm not the first person to do so. The idiomatic, reinforced by centuries of disappointment with light, now squats in this phrase, failing light. I'm going to talk about the failure of light. One of the reasons for this, of course, is this, that light won't take it personally at least, while my fellow humans might. For what distinguishes light from humans in this regard primarily would be this. Light has no sense of failure, or so I'd imagine. This tickles the most obvious question. Is it possible to fail if one has no sense of failure? I'm perhaps thinking of this because of my interest and affection for the non-human world. What might failure mean to plants and animals and to the elements? As I think back to my first sense of this question, carbon dating my history of thinking as it were, I find myself with my father. He's still young, very, very young, with a mustache and muscles that needed to work all the time. A village boy who'd been changed by the sudden encounter with cinema when he moved to Calcutta as a college student, he now wanted his little children to taste the same magic. But we were in Siliguri, a small town, then even smaller in the 1980s. In sub-Himalayan Bengal, where none of the films that had made him a convert was available. When the VCR arrived, by arrived I mean when it became affordable for middle-class families like ours, my father became a missionary. He thought of cinema as an aesthetic that was capable of reformation, and he wanted to protect his children from failing to respond with a naturalness to the medium like he had when introduced to it. My brother and I were put on a regime of Ray and Ghotok films, and occasionally, at my mother's insistence, even Mrinal Sen's. My father's industriousness in acquiring copies of these films stuns me now, for there was only one video parlor in Siliguri then, a tiny boxed room called Chaya Chobi. The word literally translates to shadow picture, a metaphor borrowed from light. It's the Bangla word for cinema. One of the first films forced on my brother and myself was Kanchenjunga, Satyajit Ray's Kanchenjunga. I later got to know that Baba had chosen this film simply for the familiarity of its title. In the Siliguri of the 80s, one could not be aware of the Kanchenjunga. It was there, just there. Not like sand in a desert, but more like a mother's eyes, which we imagined following us everywhere we went, that prevented us from doing many of the things we wanted to. On most mornings, it was visible from our terrace, It was there when we cycled to school, even though the day's busyness seemed to move it further away slightly. And it was still there in the afternoon when I followed my mother to the terrace to collect the clothes she'd hung to dry. Why would we have to watch a film about something we knew almost as closely as a relative? Kanchenjunga would be the first time Satyajit Ray would make a film to his own story. The story was in fact not meant to be set in Darjeeling, but in a bagan bari, a farmhouse in the suburbs of Calcutta. If Ray had not changed the setting, it is possible that my father would not have chosen this film as part of his instructive curriculum for his children. The story of the film wasn't new for us. We were used to relatives visiting Darjeeling to see the Kanchenjunga, and then stopping at our place in the foothills for a night before they took trains and buses to return to Calcutta and other parts of Bengal. The evening would be spent recording the disappointment with the mountain peak. They had, like the people in Ray's film, spent the entire day in expectation, moving from spot to spot, hoping desperately for a moment's sighting of the reluctant mountain peak. But they had met with no success. The word success was theirs. They used it while speaking in Bangla, as if that would emphasize their failure. Ray's genius, as we know, lies in turning this everyday event into a thriller. The suspense is built upon an axis of failure. Set over the period of a day, a Bengali family consisting of an industrialist, his wife, and their daughters move around in Darjeeling, meet or run into people from Calcutta, having decided to end the day, which also happens to be the last day of their holiday, in watching the sunset over Mount Kanchenjunga. The industrialist has 2 daughters, one of whom he is trying to get married to a man of his choice. The other daughter's marriage is breaking down. The first daughter turns down her suitor. An unemployed young man is trying to get himself a job. And yet, in spite of these human failings and failures, it is the failure of something else that is at the heart of the film. The failure of the Kanchenjunga to reveal itself to its tourists. We know that the mountains, in this case the Eastern Himalayas, are there, but they cannot move. And yet, our curiosity, what exactly is it that we seek to see? A kind of lottery allows the sighting, a function of light and mist, and light's inability to mop anything that falls on its way. What fails us, therefore, are not the mountains, but light. Here is a 9-year-old Satyajit recollecting the same mountain peak. In it is an intimation of an aesthetic that would guide the film and indeed his career. I quote, "I had been having a good time at Darjeeling ever since we arrived, but one thing made me feel quite sad. It had been misty and hazy every day, and I had not yet seen Kanchenjunga. My grandfather's painting of Kanchenjunga hung on a wall in our house in Calcutta. I was dying to see the real thing, to find out how it compared with the painting. At last, one day, while we were staying at Elgin Villa, my mother woke me up very early in the morning. I ran and stood at the window. In the painting, my grandfather had caught the evening sun falling on the snow to the left of Kanchenjunga. Now I could see the sun's first rays falling on its right. I gaped open-mouthed and watched the faint pink glow turn to golden, and from golden to a shimmering silver. Later in life, I got the chance to watch many beautiful sights, both in my own country and abroad, but I do not think anything can match the beauty of Kanchenjunga during sunrise and sunset." Unquote. As in this recollection, the Kanchenjunga does eventually reveal itself at the very end of the film. But such is the human conditioning in failure that by then the Kanchenjunga has no watchers. I see Kanchenjunga, the film, as an extension of Ray's cinematic study of failure, expressed metaphorically in the failure of light. When asked by the actor Soumitra Chatterjee why he had chosen cinema among all the other art forms that interested him, Ray replied, and I quote, "Once, when I was a student at Shantiniketan, we were taken to different parts of India to draw and paint. We even managed to visit the caves at Ajanta and Ellora. I realized that all these extraordinary works of art and literature had been created in India already. It seemed to me that there was no opportunity anymore to climb to the pinnacle of excellence in these fields. So I have chosen a medium of art in which there is room for fresh work. We haven't made such progress in cinema in our country. That is why I'm a filmmaker." Unquote. Reading Satyajit Ray's essays and interviews, one cannot not be made aware of his acute awareness of failing and how that awareness affects both the choices he makes to avoid or compensate for what he, in various places, calls risks and problems, and how those choices affect his films, primarily their aesthetic. "When we began, there was a problem at the very outset," writes Ray in the essay, 2.5 years with Oppu. He could very well use this sentence for almost every film. Coming to them after one has watched the films is to experience a lurking of the comic. For failing, its very optic is as coded in the comic as falling, its close phoneme. Ray himself uses the equivalence between failing and failing light from time to time. Writing about a scene in Pothir Pachali, his first film, he says, "The next shot was going to show Shorbojaya throwing away the remaining rice on a heap of rubbish and Bhulo, the dog, polishing it off. But this shot could not be taken on the same day that we took the previous ones. The light faded away, and so did money in our pockets." Unquote. And with the money went the rains. Nothing could be filmed during the monsoon. Here is Ray. "On bright sunny days in October, I began going to the village with Oppu, Durga, and other members of the unit and all the equipment, hoping fervently that it might rain. Even a small dark cloud in the sky made us gape and wonder if it would, by some magic, spread all over and come pouring down. Finally, one day, our prayers were answered. The sky was covered by thick black clouds and it started raining in torrents. Durga ran to join her brother under a tree, both looking for shelter and hugging each other. She chanted a rhyme under her breath in the hope that that would make it stop raining. Nebu pata koromcha, he brishti dhoreja. In Gopal Majumdar's inadequate translation, it reads, "Lemon leaves, fruit and berries, stop at once, what rain there is." And Ray continues, "It must be admitted that the scene turned out very well. Anyone who has seen the film, I think, would agree." Unquote. This is part of a pattern. The script comes to be written, plans are made, and then almost immediately upset. Ray doesn't have a plan B, as they call it now, but circumstances, the aleatory character of life, puts together another plan. I see and am touched by his pleasure in this unexpected delight and results of failing. Unexpected is a word that Ray uses often when characterizing the nature of his failure. For when is failure ever an expected thing? In an essay called Project Tiger, he writes about the harassment he faced while shooting with a tiger. I quote, "We were ready. The door of one of the cages was unfastened. Mr. Thorat called out to the tiger. It responded almost at once and sprang out of its cage to land on the open space outside. What followed was totally unexpected. Instead of walking sedately in a dignified manner, the tiger started prancing around with tremendous enthusiasm. It leapt, it jumped, it rolled about, dragging its poor trainer, who was desperately clutching the wire tied to the tiger's collar in a futile attempt to bring it under control." Unquote. After all this, when a few shots are taken and Ray returns with his team to Calcutta, he realizes that the camera had failed to work properly. The shots were too dark, so much so that the tiger was merging almost completely with a background of trees and leaves, unquote. I can't reiterate this oftentimes enough, but Ray's writing about his films, his recollections about them, is actually a record of a unique kind of anxiety, a premonition, though that might not be the exact word I'm looking for, of failure that affects the implementation of the script and the eventual optical destiny of the film. Now I cannot help noticing this arc, in broken lines as it were, between what was to be and superimposed on it what we now eventually see on screen. That awareness of the gap between the script and the modifications forced by circumstances on it reminds me of the European modernist painters, painting over an old canvas without whitening its remains, as it were. This is a record and an idiosyncratic optic of failing in Ray's work, if failure can have an optic at all. Failure, we will all agree, is a retrospective awareness, and this it shares with success. That it is always the dead frog on the dissection tray, that it can be analyzed only as a function of the past. This we have all experienced, whether from moment to moment, in our imagined half-written obituaries, or as athletes might, even though rarely, in the middle. Failure is therefore a bit like love. One is aware of it only after one has failed or fallen in love. Not that I'm equating the two, but then who can tell? That is not the kind of failure that affects Ray's aesthetic. It is not located in the past tense, but in the future, and hence its unique, even idiosyncratic relation with Kalpana, the imagination. After traveling for unending miles in search of a desert, where they needed to shoot only a couple of scenes for his film Gopigain Baghabain, Ray is exhausted. He writes, "Every 10 minutes one of us asked the driver, 'Where is the desert?' And each time he replied, 'We'll find it.'" A few paragraphs later, after many changes in what Ray calls scenery, he writes, "We had traveled for 20 miles, and yet there was no sign of the desert. Was the entire trip going to be a complete waste? The money we had spent on petrol, the time we had spent, the bumps and jerks in the jeep we had suffered?" A little later, he says, "We had taken the wrong route right from the word go. The desert was in a different direction altogether." Unquote. There is a fabular quality to these narrations, fables that seem to emphasize failing and failure as integral and unexpectedly empowering to the creative process. The desert, as imagined by him, both as scriptwriter and filmmaker, couldn't be found. And so Ray writes, "Very well, we agreed to set out once more. This time, only a mile later, I saw a place that, strictly speaking, was not a desert. But I knew I could not find a better place for the scene I had in mind. If this place had a name, we never learnt it. Here, there was plenty of sand, but not the wavy sand dunes one associates with a proper desert. The sand stretched tightly on a flat surface for as far as the eye could see. The afternoon sun fell directly on this land, its light reflecting in the sun and dazzling our eyes. It was not particularly warm in late February, but when seen through our camera, I had no doubt that this stretch of sand would seem no different from the Sahara." Unquote. The rewards of failure is a cliche. It is consoling and moralizing at the same time, and yet it is one I find myself using when thinking of how they apply to the filmmaker's work. This is, to repeat myself, a trait that belongs to the process, one that is by its very nature bound to remain invisible. The search, almost quest for the desert, the promise of finding it, discovering a desert that is not quite a desert, and then the mirage that creates the illusion of a lake. I see this as a metaphorical understanding of the rasa of failing. We reach the site for the shooting to find the actors and the remaining crew waiting anxiously. The only thing that had failed to wait for us was the sun. This is a refrain in Ray, one where the literal transforms into the poetic, one that enables what is essentially deprivation to transform into surplus. Failing light, or even fading light, both are phrases that Ray uses, is a phrase that I have used to talk about not only the relationship that a filmmaker or an artist has to light, but as a synecdoche for the possibilities that failing might open up. In one paragraph, Ray complains, there was no way we could shoot this precious scene in the fading light. In the next paragraph, he writes, one look at the sky told me that the postponement of our shooting was another blessing in disguise. The sky was now flecked with grey and white clouds. Golden sunlight streaming through the gaps in the clouds fell on the desert, thereby giving us a light that was suitably striking for this dramatic scene. Unquote. Soon, something has gone wrong. There is no smoke coming out of the engine. A visual quote that Ray had imagined as integral to the scene, and so he despairs. We had to start all over again. The man who had been in charge had been so busy watching the shooting that he had forgotten to put enough coal in the boiler. Okay, but this time we could not afford another mistake. The light was just right. Unquote. It seems to be a cycle, this pair of disappointment and delight, and they give a shape to the film, to any work of art that is almost analogical to an artist working around a disability, whether biological or circumstantial. It is akin to the painter Binod Bihari Mukherjee, Ray's teacher at Shantiniketan's Kala Bhavan, developing a way in which to paint after blindness had affected both his eyes. Ray made a short film on Mukherjee, and in a moving essay titled Binodda, quotes from the painter's explanation of his failing. I quote, this is Binod Bihari Mukherjee, talking about himself. What happens is that one develops a totally new concept of space. Space becomes a solid object, which has to be manually pushed aside in order to move forward. Nothing has any existence except what one can touch. You can see a chair and know that it is there. I will know that there is a chair only when I sit on it. Even then, I won't know whether or not it has arms until my hand brushes against them. There is another side to it, you see. I picked up that glass of tea. Until I became blind, I was never really aware of how glass felt to the touch. One develops tactile feelings about every object. But I have had problems. I cannot tell when I have run out of ink. I may be sketching happily when somebody says suddenly, "Why, your pen's not leaving any mark on your paper?" So now I have stopped. I've begun to lose interest in colors. I used to cut pieces of colored paper and make collages. But now I've come to realize that it's impossible to verbally describe the exact shade of a color. I've tried to explain it by saying it's blue like such and such an object, or it's red as such and such a flower, but there is always a doubt about its precision. What still interests me is form and tension. That's the main thing. Unquote. The Inner Eye, the title of Ray's film about Mukherjee, but also much more. What Ray is arguing for is therefore a space for failing in the tradition of unpremeditated art, an art that is as accommodative as a paragraph, an art that is as accommodative as the human heart. In the essay Films in Color, he writes about shooting his film Kanchenjunga. I quote, "I'm reminded here of my experiences while shooting Kanchenjunga. A Hindi film was also going to be shot in the same place at the same time. Bearing in mind the weather conditions in November, provisions had been made in the script of Kanchenjunga to include cloud and mist as well as sunshine. The Hindi director was going to shoot a song sequence. In the 26 days that we took to finish shooting Kanchenjunga, we took every possible advantage of the swiftly changing natural conditions. in those 26 days, the director of the Hindi film failed to shoot even that one song sequence simply because he had to wait for the sun to come out. Unquote. Ray is, as you can see, making a case for the aesthetic of provisionality, of an acceptance and consequent incorporation of the ad hoc nature of the elements and circumstances that affect the process of creativity. It is the nature of life to disappoint, and hence the natural gravitation towards an alternative, a negotiation with failing. This is from an essay called Two Problems. I quote, "Those who paint may have to make do with poor quality painting material. If one day good quality paints and brushes become expensive and scarce, if they cannot get paints, they can use chalk. And even if that is unavailable, there are pens and pencils. I have seen Nandalal Bose draw with twigs from a neem tree used normally as toothbrushes." Unquote. In another essay titled "Some Aspects of My Craft," Ray says this about designing. The designer has to work within the limits of these specifications. This is not necessarily a constricting factor, but it does impose on him a collaborative and interpretative function rather than an independent creative one. In another essay, one whose title is again an annotation about failing, "The Odds Against Us," he makes the same argument about the enriching possibilities of problems that one now takes to be the reason for failure. I quote, "The studios in Calcutta show their hallowed past in every crevice on the wall, in every tatter on the canvas that covers the ceiling. Some of the families of rodents that inhabit the rafters have lived there ever since the foundation of the industry. The floor is pitted. The camera groans as it turns. The voltage begins to drop after sundown. The general air of shabbiness is unnerving, and yet I do not mind these at all. I do not think of these as hindrances. After all, we have the essentials to make a film, and it is within us to make it badly or well. It is the bareness of means that forces us to be economical and inventive, and prevents us from turning craftsmanship into an end in itself. And there is something about creating beauty in the circumstances of shoddiness and privation that is truly exciting. Yes, I am happy to be working where I am." In an essay called Filmmaking, Ray, never a moralist, shares an anecdote that almost borders on the moral. One about the real risks and dangers about being adamant about a premeditated idea of art. He's writing about, yes, yet again, the problems that he had to face while shooting Jalshaghar, the music room. I quote, "The truck arrived in the evening. In the failing light," that's his phrase, "in the failing light, I watched the crane being pushed along a couple of stout wooden planks onto the top of the truck. It seemed a risky operation. And then, before I realized what was happening, halfway up the plank, the crane tottered for an instant and then crashed on the coolies, killing one instantly and crippling another for life. I'd stood rooted to the spot, barely 10 feet away, stunned by the magnitude and suddenness of the tragedy. It took me some time to realize that all this would not have happened if I had not set my mind on those overhead shots." Unquote. Failing light, stubbornness, as Ray reminds us, is costly. His insistence on the shooting, going to his imagined aesthetic, cost the coolie his life. It also costs artists their art. When I think of failing light, I think of Satyajit Ray and Binod Bihari Mukherjee, and I also think of the Ajanta Caves and my father. I was 9 and was again being force-fed art by my father, this time inside the Ajanta Caves. At first it was a relief to be inside the caves, a refuge from the festering heat that squats in these parts of India, refusing to leave for months. But I was a child, and children are, after its initial surprise and magic, bored by darkness. I knew little Hindi, but after my father's most serious questions to the tourist guide, I asked him what was for me the most important question. Why was it so dark here? The guide's answer was a paraphrase of what he had just narrated to us about the architecture of the caves, planned in a way so as to give the calm of darkness necessary to meditation for the Buddhist monks there. What illumined the caves was not sunlight, but the luminescence of the frescoes. I remember thinking of them as the equivalent of lamp posts in my small town, that was their purpose. Light fails even when it is tied to a lamp post. It is an animal on a leash. It cannot move beyond its penumbra. The analogy of the lamp post might have also been triggered by childhood memories of my father and neighborhood uncles kicking aged trunks of lamp posts in annoyance and anger in 1980s Bengal, kicking them until some stroke of coincidence brought them to life after the 45th kick or so, and we would believe this to be the cure to power failure. The Ajanta Caves were built between the 2nd and 5th century BC. Its walls tell stories of the lives of the Buddha as much as of the daily lives of the people who painted them, citizens of unique, even experimental early Indian states, of large groups of people in buildings and jungles, ponds and mountains. William Dalrymple mentions the colors that glow with a brilliant intensity: topaz dark, lizard green, lotus blue. And Yashodhara Dalmia, their mesmerizing synesthetic wraparound quality, which seems to loom towards the viewer. In spite of efforts at restoration, because of the nature of the painting material used, and perhaps because of a history of the caves being flooded, a large body of work stands destroyed. When I think of the Ajanta paintings, it seems to me that it is almost as if they were coded to fail, a failure intrinsic to its life, to its incomparable aesthetic. I think of the fungi and the microbes and the phototactic insects that are attracted to the painting material that gives these paintings their luminosity, those that destroy them in turn. And I think of the failing light inside the caves, what our tourist guide had called handicapped art. The lack of light hadn't allowed completion or completeness, the tall man had argued. Many years later, I would find myself thinking about this when reading the allegory of the cave in Plato's Republic, and I would wonder what it was about failing and caves and light that they would keep returning to human history in cycles of metaphors. You might be wondering why I have been talking about Ray's relationship with light through this prism of failure, or why I have been returning to the Ajanta Caves and my father in asides while talking about Ray. All of this has been to illustrate to myself as much to you that I think of failing as a rasa. Rasa is, as you would know, an aesthetic theory that goes back to the first millennium in the Indian subcontinent. It means juice, taste, essence. It is, in my understanding, as much a theory of art as a theory of emotion. Originally, it was a theory that had 8 rasas. And let me just run the list here to refresh our memory. Bhayanak, fear. Hasya, laughter. Rudra, anger. Adbhut, wonder. Bibhita, disgust. Shringar, love, romance, or attractiveness. Veera, heroism. Karuna, sadness. As we see in the Natya Shastra, Santam, peace, was added to the list later. Now, the theory of rasa is a theory of effect. Emotions or bhavas were produced as a response to the text. The fear of failing, however, begins as an emotion in the artist. You would have noticed, therefore, that by arguing for a rasa that has a life before the birth of the text and not necessarily visible in its blood afterwards, I have dislocated the sight of the rasa from effect to cause. There is no rasa in the Natya Shastra that holds in it the sense of failing. Fear is horror, not the anxiety of failing. When it plays out in our emotional lives, it changes us in ways that we recognize only in retrospect, affecting the vocabulary of self-understanding the most. It changes the language in which we speak to ourselves. That language that leads to and from a vocabulary of failing is one that cannot be shared, not even with those with whom we've shared almost everything, spit and soul, sweat and passwords. The language of failing cannot be shared, just as the rasas and our unique experience of them cannot be shared with anyone. Failing light is a phrase that has solidified over time. It is a phrase that reminds us of the impossibility of calibrating failure and reiterates the inadequacy of the vocabulary of failure. It is perhaps because of this that it has fallen through the cracks of art and literature. It might also have to do with the stigma attached to the word failing, the near criminal banishment of those who experience it in our society. One suffers from failure, after all. Turning to Ray and the Ajanta Caves and Binod Bihari and my father, I am made aware of how the sense of failure might lead to creative empowerment, that the rasa of feeling like one might fail is not a negative bhav, but one capable of producing accidents denied to premeditated art. When Rabindranath Tagore says, aro alo in a song, asking for light, more of light, or when Qazi Nazrul Islam, his contemporary, in a devotional for the goddess Kali sings, Kalo mer paer tolai, dekhe ja alon nachon. Come, look at the light beneath the dark girl's feet. One becomes aware, again and again and again, of the riches and the empowering character of failing light. Unlike the other rasas whose nature it is to be manifest, the rasa of failing is meant to be invisible. If it were visible, the work of art would have failed. That is its peculiar nature. I also think that the sense of failing as a rasa has been amplified because of the times we live in. I have often wondered why Bharat Muni and Abhinava Gupta after him did not consider the sense of failing as a rasa. The answer would perhaps come from Abhinava Gupta himself, who argues that no matter what the emotions invoked, I quote, in a truly poetic composition, the ordinary pathological symptoms of emotion lose their significance, and we have only enjoyment, unquote. Joy, enjoyment, ananda, the inseparability of joy from failing. Ray and his teacher, my father and the anonymous painters of the Ajanta Caves, recognized that failing and ananda were all part of the same neighborhood. They had all been formed by a time before failure became a new age professionalized category. I think of a common gesture of the recognition of failure in Indian culture, a gesture that is an inheritance from an older time. The biting of one's tongue when we fail. I think of that as the mudra, the gesture for failing. After all, tongue is where the rasa or juice flows from. Thank you.
Thank you, Sumana. That was really, really lovely. It is sort of wonderfully evocative, dog tracing. I mean, it's just so rich, so difficult to summarize. I was struck, this morning. So many of us raised in different contexts, raised the work of modernism and the modernists. We named a lot of them. Kafka came up, Beckett came up, Woolf, who you brought up. I mean, in a sense, modernism really is sort of quintessentially predicated on failure, right? The failure of language to match or map what you want to express. T.S. Eliot, Proof Rock, talks about he says it is impossible to say just what I mean. The shadow that falls between the desire and the act, and so, I mean, there is that sort of very very established sense of thinking about failure and how failure becomes the precondition of art. And today, I mean, you've talked about failure as a precondition of art, but in a completely different way. And I just love to hear, if you have any thoughts on your own creative process as well. I mean, since you're a creative writer and reader and a keen watcher of cinema. I mean, how would you like to understand? How would you like to think of failing? For yourself, as a writer, for as a critic, as somebody who examines literature and art.
The easiest cop-out for me would be to say that I don't, and I have failed to find an answer for this question. I think when one is writing, or I can only imagine this of the other arts, no matter what one is trying to do, one has the sense of failing always, and even after. As you would remember, you sent me proofs of the essay that I've written for your book, and I couldn't bear or dare to go through it, and I relied on you because the sense it's not only about immediacy, but there's not just a sense of alienation that's about what's come out of you. And I don't have biological children of my own, and I sometimes worry and feel bad for my parents if they have the same sense of alienation, that the kind I feel for the words that have come out of me. I think you are right to say that failure is a part of the creative process. I was interested in looking at Ray in particular, but also because I have been discussing Woolf with my students a lot, about how the sense of failing is coded into the work of art itself. So when, for instance, Anurag was talking about success and failing, and he said there's no formula for success, I would have liked to ask him whether there's a formula for failing. So there's none, as we know. I mean, also because every failure is so unique, you don't fail the same way twice. It's like, what Heraclitus said about putting your feet into the river. About my own negotiations with failing, sometimes it also has to do with the sense of having failed a genre in our, as Professor Amit Chaudhary said in his keynote about, in his concept note about free market and the relationship with failing. When your publisher, for instance, when the publisher put the word novel into the title of my book, it was just called Missing. They decided that they would call it Missing a Novel. I was very uncomfortable with the category because I did not want to handhold the reader and tell them what it was going to be. Also, I was just discussing this with someone yesterday. Naming a genre creates expectations, and you always, as soon as you've created a name, as soon as you've given any relationship a name, you're scared of failing that relationship because of the name you've given it. Similarly with genres, that you call it a novel and you feel this does not meet the expectations of the novel. And I'm sure what I wrote did not meet the expectations of the genre as well. So these are thoughts that come to one from time to time, I suppose, and coagulate and then inform what you write. in your own way. I haven't really, because one is so convinced about being a failure that one doesn't have, very much time to think of, very much else, I suppose.
Okay, we'll open it up to the audience. We have about 10 minutes. 10 minutes for questions. There's a question.
Wonderful to. Thank you for your absolutely lovely talk, and also for some of the responses that you provided us, which are just lovely. But I wanted to just challenge you a little bit on something, which is you talked about the inadequacy of the vocabulary of failure. Well, I don't want to challenge you. I want you to amplify on why you think it's. What are the particular inadequacies of the vocabulary of failure as opposed to any other vocabulary?
I was looking at it through the theory of rasa, as I just told, spoke about. I think the sense of failure as we understand it today, and I can only imagine this, of course, might have been different or must have been different during the 8th or the 11th century when Abhinavagupta adds Santam or Shantaras. I was curious to understand why this sense of failing that troubles us, whether we are creative practitioners or not, why that hadn't been thought of as a rasa. And because I discovered a filmmaker like Ray's, his writings, and I found that the disappointment he expresses about things not going his way, about repeatedly, becoming a failure, and that followed by the sense of joy that attends the second, or what, it's not the second, but what follows it. I just thought that the sense of failing when it comes to creative practice is welded to the sense of joy or delight. And therefore, because, as Abhinavagupta says, that no matter whether you experience the comic or any of these rasas, during your experience of the text, what remains with you is just the joy. So you go to the book and you think of the book, you might have cried while reading it, but when you think of the book, say 20 years later, you think of it, I really enjoyed that book. So he thinks of enjoyment or ananda as a more permanent emotion. And I think the sense of failing too, because it appears so far ahead in the process and is there and is very quickly, or not very quickly always, followed by ananda, that vocabulary has not been adequately created. I'm not sure I answered your question adequately.
No, wonderful, thank you.
Sorry, okay, so you're closer in
Thank you. Thank you. Just to follow up, I'm completely ignorant about the theory of rasa, so I'm hoping you will enlighten me. But I was thinking about this conjunction of failure and delight that you were speaking about. And in the European tradition, there is a term for it in aesthetic thinking, which is the sublime, which is precisely an overwhelming sense of pleasure at a failure of imagination. Kant calls it negative pleasure. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if that resonates at all with the tradition that you're thinking about.
If you're thinking of the Burkean sublime, I don't think I'm thinking of how Burke thought of the sublime in terms of, particularly in terms of scope. Sorry, no, particularly in terms of scale. That's not what I'm thinking about. Maybe we could talk about the theory of rasa a little later. Yes, I know.
Yeah. Sure. Thank you. It's really wonderful. There are a lot of things here, but one thing I especially stood out to me was how you restored the failure, the idea of failure to the non-human. And when you move it away from the human context to the non-human, I kept thinking of the word not of failure, but the word wasting away. That word, I'm not sure you used the word in your talk, but the sense of wasting away. And there's a kind of a richness in the notion of wasting away. I was actually thinking of one comment by Rabindranath that, if life is a waste, let it go waste. The sense of waste shows how plentiful it is. So something wasting away in a kind of strange way shows what a great plenty. I think that's what Rabindranath was trying to get at. And I was thinking if you... That too. I was thinking of Jibon Britha Galo, Britha Jete Dao. That one I was thinking of, but yeah, that too. The sense of, and I was wondering if you could say something about that, when we move things away, like the thought of, even somebody said that, when you use the word weed is not a plant. A weed is whatever we don't want, and so it's quite striking. It struck me that when you move away to the realm of the, I won't say inanimate, but in non-human, wastage is actually a very rich and productive kind of terrain, because it started with the failure of light, because we think of when light fades, it's not a failure, it's a kind of slow disappearance, crumbling of light, and that crumbling act is actually an act of beauty.
I didn't use the word wasting away. As for some reason, wasting away reminds me of Keats in a letter writing about him wasting away because of what he was suffering from. I agree with you completely about the inexhaustibility of the elements. No matter how much time you've used up, there's always time. Time always remains. No matter how much light you've used up. We can't say that anymore for water. About the accommodativeness of failure in the non-human world, I had included this, but this was a much longer paper that I was trying to cut, even before I kind of entered this, began speaking. So I'll try to answer this with the help of a metaphor from plant life. So grass, as you know, if you cover it with a brick for a long period of time, it suffers from a process that we learnt in high school was called etiolation. So it loses its color, it becomes skinnier or thinner, it develops. So I think of art or the creative process as something akin to that when deprived of something, it'll find a way to live. It'll just learn to live differently. I think we know this for water, that, you can just create a block or a blockage and it'll flow in the other direction. This is true for most elements. So I'm not sure I answered this correctly again or adequately.
Okay, we just have time for one last question. Okay, a quick one, and then so why don't you ask your question first, and then we'll go to you.
What do you, I really loved your talk, that's definitely there. How do you understand the role of forgetfulness and the role of memory in the process of failing? Because failure does bring in a sense of fear. I mean, you always have a fear that you would fail, and failure then, turns out to be something else. It may be pleasurable or something else, but the moment itself, you might maybe not remember. Maybe that moment itself is so overwhelmingly rich in terms of the experience that you don't probably remember for a very long time, because when you experience the same experience again, that becomes entirely new experience. So how do you see the role of forgetfulness and memory in failing?
Sumana, thank you very much for a lovely paper. Just a little note, footnote rather, to what you said about the cinematic image or metaphor of failing light in Ray. I'm reminded of another film by Ritwik Ghatak, where this appears in a different light. Oh, sorry for the pun. Yeah, it appears in a different way. The Meketakatara, where the stars have been covered by the clouds. But the ultimate implication, as we see in a kind of post-partition period, that it has a tragic content, the entire, and the nature of the empowerment is through a tragic idiom in many ways. So, I mean, it's a different kind of a treatment of a failing or fading light. Yeah, do you have anything to?
Yeah. Yes, it is. In fact, Ray also uses this in Arunne Din Ratri, a similar metaphor of light. To answer your question, Anup, I'm not sure I completely get what you are trying to ask me. I think I'm not so as much interested in failing, the sense of failing that we experience from time to time, and all of us do. I think that makes us to fail, and to have the sense of failing, to make mistakes is what makes us human. I don't know whether any other, whether animal life or plant life or the elements experience this. But my interest is more in the creative process. I think what we see in the end has to be forgetful of this moment of failing. If it were to exist in the text, then the text would have failed as a work of art. That would be my response.
Okay, so we'll have to close the session now, but you can carry on the conversation, I suppose, over the tea break. Thank you. Thank you, Suchi.